The woman on the Forbes cover was the same woman he once called a failure. Daniel froze, whiskey glass midair, as the bar TV flashed her face. Emily Carter, America's newest billionaire. Laughter erupted around him, but not at him. 5 years ago, he had smirked across a polished table and said she would never make it without him. Now her name echoed across the country while his faded into silence. His jaw tightened, memories crashing back. The night he broke her, the moment she walked away without a word. He thought he ended her story. He didn't know. That was exactly where she began. The woman on the Forbes cover was the same woman he once called a failure. The words echoed from the flat screen mounted above the polished oak bar, cutting clean through the low hum of conversation and the clink of ice against crystal. Daniel Brooks didn't move at first. His fingers remained wrapped around his glass, condensation slipping slowly onto his cuff as if time itself had stalled. Then the image shifted, sharp, undeniable. Emily Carter. Her name appeared in bold white letters beneath a portrait that looked nothing like the woman he remembered. She stood poised in a tailored ivory suit, sunlight catching the edge of her hair, her expression calm, controlled, untouchable. Around him, laughter rose, not cruel, not loud, but knowing. A few heads turned in his direction, subtle, almost polite, the kind of attention that didn't need to be announced to be felt. Daniel swallowed, but the burn of the bourbon did nothing to steady him. 5 years. 5 years since he had last seen her standing across from him at that long marble dining table, her hands folded too tightly in her lap, her voice too quiet for the room. He could still hear himself, clear as day, leaning back in his chair, the faintest smirk playing at his lips as he said it, as if it were a fact, as if it were kindness disguised as truth. You're not built for success, Emily. You never were. The room had gone still then too, but for a different reason. Back then, the silence had belonged to him. Now it belonged to her. On the screen, the anchor's voice continued. Something about valuation, growth, a billion-dollar empire built in under 4 years. But the words blurred together, meaningless compared to the image burned into his mind. Emily, stepping out of a black car, cameras flashing, reporters calling her name like she was someone who had always been meant to be seen. His grip tightened around the glass, knuckles paling as memory rushed in, uninvited and relentless. The night she left. No shouting, no tears, just the quiet click of her suitcase handle and the soft sound of the door closing behind her. He hadn't followed. He hadn't needed to. In his mind, her story had already ended. A chapter closed, a mistake corrected, a failure filed neatly away. That was how he remembered it. Simple. Final. But the woman on that screen was anything but simple, anything but final. She didn't look back. She didn't look broken. She looked like someone who had been building something all along, piece by invisible piece, while he had been too certain, too comfortable, too convinced he had been right. A man beside him let out a low whistle. $1 billion, he muttered, shaking his head. Imagine that. Daniel didn't respond. He couldn't. Because for the first time in years, something unfamiliar settled in his chest. Not loud, not sharp, but heavy. A quiet realization, creeping in with the same certainty he once used against her. He had mistaken her silence for weakness. He had mistaken her patience for dependence. And now, as her face lingered on that screen, framed by success he couldn't comprehend, one truth pressed harder than all the rest. He thought he had ended her story. He had no idea. He was standing at the beginning of it. She remembered the exact moment his words stopped hurting and started echoing. It was not dramatic. There was no grand realization, no sudden surge of strength. It happened in a cramped studio apartment that smelled faintly of old coffee and fresh paint, the kind of place where the radiator clicked through the night and the windows rattled when the wind picked up. Emily sat on the edge of a narrow bed, her laptop balanced on her knees, the glow of the screen casting a pale light across her face. Another rejection email. Polite. Professional. Final. She read it once, then again, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if a different outcome might appear if she waited long enough. It did not. For a moment, the silence in the room pressed in on her. Heavy and familiar. The version of her that Daniel had known would have folded into it, would have let it confirm everything he had ever said. But this time, something shifted. Not loud. Not visible. just a quiet refusal to agree. She closed the email, opened another tab, and kept going. The days that followed blurred into each other, measured not in hours but in attempts. Coffee cups stacked by the sink, sticky notes covering the walls, a rhythm of failure that slowly began to change shape. She taught herself what she did not know. She rebuilt what she had once given up. Each small step felt invisible, almost meaningless, but she took it anyway. While the world she had left behind continued without her, she built something that did not need it. There were nights when doubt returned, slipping in through the cracks, whispering in a voice that sounded too much like his. You are not built for this. You never were. She did not argue with it. She did not fight it. She simply worked past it, her fingers moving across the keyboard, her mind focused on the next problem, the next solution, the next step forward. Months passed, then years. The apartment changed. The radiator was replaced by central heating, the narrow bed by a larger one. The walls cleared as the sticky notes turned into systems, into plans, into something that began to hold weight beyond the room it was created in. People started to listen, quietly at first. A meeting here, a call there, then more. Investors who had once ignored her emails now waited for her replies. Her name, once dismissed, began to circulate in rooms she had never been invited into before. Through it all, she remained the same in the ways that mattered. She did not announce her progress. She did not return to prove anything. She did not look back. Because the truth was, she was not building for them. She was building for herself. On a late evening, long after the city outside had dimmed into a scatter of lights, she stood by the window of a new office, one that overlooked blocks of quiet movement below. The glass reflected her image back at her, steady, composed, unfamiliar in the best way. She reached for her phone, not to call, not to share, but simply to check the numbers one more time. They were real, not imagined, not temporary, real. She set the phone down, her reflection still holding her gaze. There was no need to say anything, no need to relive the past or rewrite it, because somewhere along the way, without noise, without permission, without anyone noticing until it was too late, she had already become something he said she could never be. And she had done it in silence. The next morning, the world did not slow down for Daniel Brooks, but it felt like it had. The city outside moved with its usual rhythm, traffic flowing, people rushing, conversations overlapping in a steady current of noise, yet everything around him seemed distant, muted, like he was standing just outside of it all. The television in his apartment replayed the segment he had already seen 3 times, each repetition sharpening the edges of something he could no longer ignore. Emily Carter. Her name was no longer something he could dismiss or correct or redefine. It was fixed now, anchored by numbers that spoke louder than anything he had ever said. Billion-dollar valuation. Fastest growing company in its sector. A self-made success story. The phrases stacked one after another, clean and undeniable. He sat at the edge of his kitchen counter, the morning light cutting across the marble surface, catching the rim of his untouched coffee. It had gone cold, but he did not notice. His mind was elsewhere, pulled back to fragments he had once considered insignificant. The way she used to sit quietly during conversations, listening more than speaking. The way she would pause before responding, as if measuring her words against something deeper than the moment. He had called it hesitation. Weakness. A lack of drive. Now it replayed differently. Not hesitation. Restraint. Not weakness. Control. His jaw tightened as he stood, pacing slowly across the room, each step heavy with a realization that refused to be pushed aside. He had mistaken her silence for absence. But she had been there all along, observing, absorbing, understanding more than he ever cared to see. The phone on the counter buzzed, pulling him back. A message from a colleague, casual, almost amused. Did you see this? He did not respond. There was nothing to say, because anything he could have said would sound smaller than the truth unfolding in front of him. Across the city, in a building of glass and steel that reflected the sky like a mirror, Emily stood near the edge of a conference room, her hand resting lightly against the back of a chair. The room was quiet now, the meeting finished, the voices that once filled it replaced by a calm that felt earned. Papers lay neatly arranged on the table, screens dimmed, decisions already set into motion. She did not rush to leave. She did not reach for her phone to check the headlines or count the reactions. She already knew. Not because of the numbers, not because of the recognition, but because she had lived every step that led here. The nights that stretched longer than they should have. The moments when progress felt invisible. The quiet persistence that no one had witnessed but her. She walked toward the window, the city spreading out beneath her, vast and indifferent in the way only a city could be. Cars moved like threads of light. People reduced to motion and purpose, lives intersecting without ever touching. She had once felt small within it, like she needed permission to take up space. Now she simply existed within it, not louder, not more visible, just certain. Behind her, a screen still displayed the headline that had begun to circulate across the country, her name embedded in it like it had always belonged there. She did not turn back to look at it. She did not need to, because the validation had never been the goal. It was only the result. Back in his apartment, Daniel stopped pacing, his reflection catching in the dark glass of the television screen. For a moment, he saw himself clearly, not as the man who had been certain, but as the man who had been wrong. Not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. His shoulders lowered slightly, the tension giving way to something quieter, heavier. He had needed an audience to feel certain of his place in the world. He had needed to say the words out loud, to define her in a way that made him feel secure. She had done the opposite. She had said nothing. She had taken every doubt, every dismissal, every assumption, and turned it into something that did not require explanation. The room around him felt smaller now, not physically, but in comparison to something he could not reach. He looked back. At the frozen image on the screen, her face steady, composed, untouched by the past he still carried. And for the first time, the truth settled without resistance. He had not lost her. He had simply never understood her. And now he never would. The invitation arrived without urgency. A simple envelope placed neatly on the edge of Emily's desk, its weight almost unnoticeable against the stack of documents she had already reviewed that morning. It was thick, understated, the kind of paper that did not need to announce its importance because it assumed it would be recognized. She glanced at it briefly before continuing her work, her pen moving steadily across the page, signing, approving, deciding. It was only when the room fell quiet again that she reached for it, her fingers brushing the smooth surface with the same calm precision she applied to everything else. The event was familiar. A private business forum, invitation only, attended by names that shaped industries and conversations that rarely reached the public. She had never been invited before. Not when she was building. Not when she was proving. Only now, when there was nothing left to prove. Across the city, Daniel stood in front of his closet, his reflection caught between two versions of himself he could no longer reconcile. The suit he chose was deliberate, tailored, sharp, the kind of appearance that had always given him a sense of control. Tonight, it felt different. Not weaker, not diminished, just insufficient. He adjusted his cuff, his movements slower than usual, his thoughts drifting back to the message he had received earlier that day. An invitation. The same event. The same room. For a moment, he had considered declining. Not out of fear, but out of something harder to define. But he had accepted. Because a part of him needed to see it. Not on a screen, not through headlines, but in reality. He needed to understand what had changed, even if the answer unsettled him. The venue rose into the evening skyline, its glass exterior reflecting the fading light of the city, a quiet statement of presence and permanence. Inside, the air carried the low murmur of conversation, the kind that never needed to be loud to carry weight. Emily stepped into the space without hesitation, her heels soft against the polished floor, her posture relaxed but unmistakably grounded. She did not pause to take in the room. She did not scan for recognition. She simply entered, as if she had always belonged there. Conversations shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to be felt. A glance here, a nod there. Her name moved through the room in quiet exchanges, not as a question, but as confirmation. Daniel arrived minutes later, the transition from outside to inside sharper than he expected. The light, the voices, the presence of people who measured success in ways he once understood. He moved through them with practiced ease, acknowledging greetings, returning nods, playing the role he had always known how to play. But something beneath it felt altered, like a rhythm he could not quite match anymore. Then he saw her. Not across the room in some dramatic reveal, not surrounded by spectacle, but standing near a group of investors, her expression composed, her attention focused on the conversation in front of her. She was not trying to be seen. She did not need to be. The space around her adjusted naturally, as if it recognized her presence without requiring her to claim it. Daniel slowed, his steps losing their certainty for just a moment. The distance between them was not far, measured in feet, but it carried years within it. Memories, assumptions, words that could not be taken back, all suspended in the space he now had to cross. She turned slightly, not because she sensed him, but because the conversation shifted, her gaze moving with it. And then, for the first time since that night, their eyes met. There was no shock in hers, no hesitation, no trace of the woman he had once defined. Only recognition. Calm. Complete. The kind that did not need to revisit the past to understand it. Daniel stopped, the noise of the room fading at the edges, replaced by a stillness that felt almost deliberate. In that moment, there was nothing left to reinterpret, nothing left to explain away. The truth stood between them, quiet and unshakable. He had spoken loudly once, certain of what she was. She had answered with silence, certain of what she would become. And now, standing in the same room, under the same light, he realized something that no headline, no number, no recognition could fully capture. She had not come back to prove him wrong. She had come back as someone who no longer needed him to be right. For a brief moment, neither of them moved. The space between them held something heavier than tension, something quieter, more final. Emily did not step forward. She did not look away. She simply held his gaze with the same steady composure she had carried into the room, as if this moment had already been accounted for long before it happened. Around them, conversations continued, glasses clinked, low laughter drifted through the air, but it all felt distant, like a separate world that no longer had any bearing on what stood between them now. Daniel cleared his throat, the sound subtle but enough to break the stillness. He took a step closer, then another, each one measured, as if he were approaching something fragile, something that could not be forced or rushed. Up close, the details became clearer. The calm in her expression was not indifference. It was certainty, the kind that did not need validation, did not look for reaction, did not wait for acknowledgement. "Emily," he said, her name unfamiliar in his own voice, stripped of the confidence it once carried. She inclined her head slightly, a polite acknowledgement, nothing more. Not cold, not warm, just precise. Daniel. There was no accusation in the way she said it. No edge, no hesitation, no trace of the past layered into the syllables. It was simply his name, spoken as it existed now, separate from everything that had come before. He let out a small breath, one he had not realized he was holding, his hand shifting slightly at his side before settling again. He searched for something to say, something that could bridge the distance he was only now beginning to understand. "I saw the news," he began, the words sounding thinner than he expected. "Congratulations." It was the kind of sentence that should have felt sufficient. It was what people said in moments like this. But as soon as it left his mouth, he knew it was not enough. Not for what stood between them. Emily held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded once, a small, controlled movement. "Thank you." No elaboration. No false modesty. No attempt to fill the silence that followed. She did not need to. The silence belonged to him now. He shifted his weight slightly, his eyes flickering for just a moment as if searching for something familiar in her expression, something he could recognize, something that would make this interaction fit into the framework he had always used to understand her. But there was nothing to grasp onto. The version of her that had once responded to his tone, his approval, his dismissal, was gone. In its place stood someone who did not adjust herself to meet him at all. "You have done well," he added, the pause between the words betraying the effort it took to say them. It was not praise. Not really. It was an attempt to reframe, to reduce something vast into something manageable. Emily's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to acknowledgement. "I have done what I needed to do," she replied, her voice even, unhurried. There was no emphasis on the achievement, no attachment to the scale of it, as if the outcome was simply a natural extension of something she had already decided long ago. Daniel nodded slowly, the movement more reflex than intention. The room around them began to return, sound filtering back in, movement resuming its place at the edges of his awareness. But the clarity remained, sharp and undeniable. He had expected something else. A reaction, a moment, perhaps even a trace of the past resurfacing in the space between them. Instead, there was only this. Calm, complete, unaffected. Emily glanced briefly toward the group she had been speaking with, then back at him, the gesture subtle but clear. Her attention had somewhere else to be. Not because she was avoiding him, but because she was no longer anchored to him in any way. "It was good to see you," she said, the words polite, final in a way that did not require emphasis. Then, without waiting for a response, she turned, her steps as steady as when she had entered the room, her presence folding back into the quiet current of conversation that surrounded her. Daniel remained where he was, watching as the space she left behind closed naturally, seamlessly, as if it had never been disrupted at all. His hands lowered slightly at his sides, the weight of the moment settling not in what was said, but in what was not. He had once defined her with certainty, reduced her to something small enough to understand. Now, standing in the same room, having said the words he thought he needed to say, he realized something far more difficult to accept. There was nothing left for him to define. She had already done that herself. The sound of her footsteps disappeared into the rhythm of the room, but something in Daniel remained suspended, as if his body had not yet caught up with what had just happened. Conversations resumed around him, seamless, uninterrupted, the world continuing as it always had, but he no longer moved within it the same way. He exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to where she had been standing only moments ago, now replaced by other faces, other voices, none of them carrying the same weight. It was not what she said that stayed with him. It was what she did not. No questions, no hesitation, no attempt to reopen anything that had long since closed for her. He turned slightly, reaching for a glass from a passing tray, more out of habit than intention. The cool surface pressed against his palm, grounding, familiar, but it did not bring back the sense of control he once associated with these spaces. Across the room, Emily listened as a man in his early 50s spoke about expansion strategies, his tone measured, confident, the kind of conversation she had learned to navigate without effort. She nodded occasionally, her attention precise, her responses thoughtful but economical, never more than necessary. There was no performance in it. No need to impress, no need to prove. The room adjusted to her presence without resistance, as if it had already accepted her place within it. A woman standing nearby leaned in slightly, lowering her voice with quiet curiosity. "You have been moving very quickly," she said. "Most people do not scale like that." Emily met her gaze, her expression steady, the faintest hint of reflection passing through her eyes. "Most people wait until they feel ready," she replied. I did not. There was no pride in the statement, no emphasis, just a simple acknowledgement of the difference. The woman nodded slowly, absorbing it, while the conversation continued, unfolding naturally, without pause. Daniel watched from a distance he had not chosen, but now understood he could not close. He noticed the details he would have overlooked before. The way people listened when she spoke. The way no one interrupted her. The way her presence did not demand attention, but held it anyway. It was not loud. It was not forceful. It was something else entirely. Something he had never taken the time to recognize when it mattered. A faint memory surfaced, uninvited. A night years ago, when she had tried to explain an idea, something small, something he had dismissed before she could finish. He had cut her off with a laugh, not harsh, not overtly cruel, just enough to shift the tone, to signal that it was not worth pursuing. He had not remembered it until now. She had, not in words, not in reaction, but in everything she had built without him. He took a slow sip from his glass, the taste registering only faintly as his focus remained fixed across the room. There was a clarity settling in, not sudden, not dramatic, but steady. He had always believed that power came from being seen, from being heard, from shaping the narrative in real time. But what stood in front of him now challenged that belief in a way he could not ignore. She had stepped outside of that entirely. She had built something that did not rely on perception, on approval, on immediate recognition. And because of that, when recognition came, it was not something she needed. It was simply something that followed. Emily glanced briefly toward the far side of the room, her eyes passing over the space without searching, without lingering, then returning to the conversation in front of her. There was no trace of him in that movement. No awareness that required acknowledgement. No thread that tied her attention back to where he stood. The distance between them had shifted again, not physically, but in a way that felt far more permanent. Daniel lowered his glass, his shoulders settling into a stillness that felt unfamiliar. For the first time, he understood that there was nothing left to recover, nothing left to revisit, nothing left to reinterpret in his favor. She had not just moved forward. She had moved beyond the version of him that had once defined her. And in doing so, she had left him standing exactly where he had chosen to remain. The evening moved forward, but something in the room had subtly shifted, not in volume or pace, but in gravity. Conversations continued, deals were discussed, quiet alliances formed in corners where voices lowered just enough to suggest importance. Yet an invisible current kept circling back to her. Emily did not acknowledge it. She did not need to. She stood near the center of a new conversation now, one that had formed around her without invitation, her presence acting as a quiet axis others adjusted to. A man across from her, younger, ambitious, leaned forward slightly, his tone respectful but edged with curiosity. "You scaled faster than anyone expected," he said. "What changed?" Emily considered the question for a moment, her gaze steady, not searching for the right answer, but selecting the most precise one. "Nothing changed," she replied. "I just stopped waiting for permission." The words settled between them, simple, unembellished, but carrying a weight that did not need explanation. Around them, a few people exchanged glances, subtle, thoughtful, as if recognizing something they had overlooked in their own paths. Daniel heard it from where he stood, not close enough to be part of the circle, but close enough to understand every word. He felt it land in a place he could not ignore, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as a truth that stood on its own. He shifted slightly, his posture adjusting as if trying to re-anchor himself in a space that no longer responded to him the way it once had. A familiar face approached him, offering a handshake, a brief exchange about market trends, projections, the kind of conversation he had mastered years ago. He responded automatically, his words accurate, his tone measured, but his focus drifted, pulled back again and again to the same point across the room. He had spent years believing that presence meant control, that being at the center of attention meant holding influence. But now, watching her, he understood something different. She was not controlling the room. She was not trying to. And yet, the room adjusted around her anyway. It was not about visibility. It was about substance. Emily excused herself from the group with a small nod, her movement smooth, unhurried, as she stepped away toward the edge of the room where the large windows framed the city below. The glass reflected her silhouette faintly, blending her into the skyline beyond, a quiet alignment between where she stood and everything she had built to get there. She rested her hand lightly against the cool surface, her eyes tracing the lines of lights stretching through the streets, each one a path, a direction, a possibility she had once navigated alone. There was no surge of triumph, no need to revisit the distance she had traveled. Only a steady awareness of where she was now, and the quiet certainty that it had been earned. Behind her, footsteps approached, slower this time, more deliberate. She did not turn immediately. She did not need to. The presence was familiar, but no longer significant in the way it once had been. Daniel stopped a few feet away, the distance intentional, as if he understood that crossing it required something more than proximity. He did not speak right away. For once, he allowed the silence to exist without filling it. Emily turned then, her expression unchanged, her gaze meeting his with the same calm clarity that had defined every moment since they had seen each other again. There was no tension in it, no expectation, just awareness. Daniel inhaled quietly, the words forming slower than they once would have, stripped of certainty, of assumption, of the ease he used to rely on. "I was wrong," he said finally, the statement simple, unguarded, without elaboration or defense. It did not reach for forgiveness. It did not attempt to reshape the past. It only acknowledged it. Emily held his gaze for a moment, her eyes steady, reading not the words themselves, but the absence of everything that used to surround them. She nodded once, a small, measured movement, accepting the statement for what it was, nothing more, nothing less. "Yes," she replied softly. Not sharp, not cold, just true. The words settled between them, complete in its simplicity, leaving no space for reinterpretation. Daniel exhaled, something in his posture easing, not because the weight had lifted, but because it had finally settled into its proper place. He did not move closer. He did not try to extend the moment. For the first time, he understood that this was not a conversation to be continued, not a connection to be repaired, not a story to be revisited. It was a point of clarity, and it belonged entirely to her. The word lingered for only a moment before it dissolved into the quiet space between them, but its effect did not fade with it. Emily turned her gaze back toward the city beyond the glass, her posture unchanged, her hand resting lightly against the window, as if the conversation had already reached its natural conclusion. Daniel remained where he stood, not frozen, not uncertain, but aware in a way that felt unfamiliar. There was nothing left to correct, nothing left to reinterpret, and for the first time, he did not try. The room behind them continued its steady rhythm, voices weaving through one another, the subtle rise and fall of influence playing out in quiet exchanges. But here, at the edge of the space, everything felt more defined, more still. Emily let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, her eyes tracing the distant movement of headlights far below, each one moving with purpose, without hesitation, without needing to be acknowledged. It reminded her of something she had learned long ago, in those early days when everything felt uncertain and unfinished. Progress did not announce itself. It did not wait for recognition. It moved forward regardless. She turned slightly, not fully back to him, just enough to acknowledge his presence without inviting it. "You do not need to carry it," she said, her voice even, unburdened by the past it referenced. Daniel frowned faintly, the line forming more from thought than confusion. "Carry what?" he asked quietly, though he already knew. Emily's gaze met his again, steady, unshaken. "The version of me you were wrong about," she replied. There was no accusation in it, no edge, just clarity. "It does not exist anymore." The words settled differently than anything else had that evening. Not heavy, not sharp, just final. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering a fraction as the meaning reached him in full. He had been holding on to it, not out of guilt alone, but out of habit, out of a need to reconcile something that no longer required reconciliation. He had been trying to understand her through a version of her that had already disappeared. "I thought," he began, then stopped, the sentence losing its structure before it could form. Emily waited, not impatiently, not expectantly, simply allowing the space to exist. He shook his head slightly, a quiet acknowledgement of his own unfinished thought. "It does not matter what I thought," he said instead, the words more grounded this time, less about explanation and more about acceptance. Emily inclined her head slightly, a subtle recognition of the shift. It was enough. Behind them, a voice called her name, polite but firm, drawing her attention back to the room, back to the present that no longer intersected with the past standing a few feet away. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at Daniel, the movement brief, efficient. "Take care, Daniel," she said, the phrase simple, complete, carrying no hidden meaning beyond itself. It was not dismissal. It was not invitation. It was closure, delivered without ceremony. He nodded once, the motion small but certain. "You too," he replied, his voice steady in a way it had not been earlier. She turned then, fully this time, her steps carrying her back into the flow of the room, where conversations resumed around her as naturally as they had before, her presence folding into them without disruption. Daniel remained by the window, his reflection now faintly visible in the glass, layered over the city beyond. He studied it for a moment, not critically, not defensively, just observing. The man looking back at him was not the one who had spoken so confidently years ago, nor was he entirely the one who had walked into this room earlier that evening. Something had shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but in a way that could not be undone. He turned away from the glass, his steps slower, more deliberate as he moved back into the space he understood, the conversations he could navigate, the world that still operated within rules he recognized. But even there, something remained different. The certainty he once carried no longer fit the same way. And as the evening continued around him, he realized that what he had witnessed was not a return, not a confrontation, not even a resolution in the way he would have defined it before. It was something else entirely. A quiet ending to something that had already been finished long ago, and the unmistakable beginning of something he had never been part of. The night thinned gradually, not with a sudden end, but with a quiet unraveling of conversations that had served their purpose. Guests began to drift toward the exits in measured waves, their voices lowering, their steps slower, as if the weight of the evening followed them out into the city. Emily remained for a moment longer, standing near the edge of the room where the light softened and the noise no longer pressed in. A final exchange, a brief handshake, a nod of acknowledgement. Nothing extended beyond what was necessary. She had learned the value of that. Outside, the air carried a cool clarity, the kind that sharpened the edges of thought without demanding attention. The city stretched wide, alive in a way that did not depend on any single moment, any single person. A car door opened, quiet, precise. She paused before stepping in, her gaze lifting once more toward the skyline, not searching, not reflecting, just observing. There had been a time when she would have measured this moment against the past, weighed it, compared it, tried to define what it meant in relation to what had been. Now, there was no need. It stood on its own, complete. She entered the car, the door closing with a soft finality that did not echo. Inside, the world narrowed to a calm, controlled space, the city lights passing in smooth lines beyond the window. Her phone rested beside her, screen dim, notifications waiting, headlines continuing to circulate. She did not reach for it. Not yet. Across the street, Daniel stepped out moments later, the transition from the controlled environment of the venue to the open air more noticeable than before. The sounds of the city returned in layers, distant traffic, a passing conversation, the hum of something constant and unchanging. He adjusted his jacket slightly, his movements slower, less automatic. For a brief moment, he stood still, watching as a black car pulled away from the curb, its shape blending quickly into the flow of the street. He did not need to confirm who was inside. He already knew. He exhaled, the breath steady, not heavy, not strained, just present. There was no sharp realization waiting for him, no dramatic shift in understanding. That had already happened. What remained now was quieter, more deliberate. He turned, beginning to walk in the opposite direction, his pace measured, his attention no longer split between what was and what had been. The evening had not given him something to fix, something to reclaim, something to chase. It had taken something away, the certainty that had once defined him, the version of the past he had held on to. And in its place, it had left something less comfortable, but far more accurate. Across the city, the car moved steadily through the streets, each turn precise, each stop brief. Emily leaned back slightly, her gaze following the shifting reflections of light across the glass, her posture relaxed, unguarded, in a way that did not require defense. The quiet inside the car was not empty. It was intentional, a space she had built over time, piece by piece, choice by choice, until it no longer needed to be filled. Her phone lit briefly, a message preview appearing before fading again. She glanced at it this time, not out of urgency, but awareness. A single line from an unknown number. "Congratulations. You earned this." She read it once, then set the phone back down without replying. Not because it did not matter, but because it did not need a response. The acknowledgement had already been made, not in words, but in everything that had led here. The car slowed, turning onto a quieter street, the noise of the city softening as buildings gave way to a more private space. The driver pulled to a smooth stop, the engine settling into silence. Emily did not move immediately. She sat for a moment longer, her reflection faint in the darkened window, layered over the last stretch of the night. There was no surge of emotion waiting for her, no need to define what this moment meant. Because for the first time, she was not measuring her life against anything that had come before. She reached for the door, her hand steady, her movement unhurried, and stepped out into the quiet that belonged entirely to her. Behind her, somewhere in the distance, the city continued without pause. But where she stood now, there was no echo of the past, no shadow of who she had been, no trace of the words that once tried to define her. Only the undeniable presence of who she had become, and the quiet certainty that she had done it without needing anyone to see it happen. The morning arrived without ceremony. a soft wash of light slipping through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Emily's apartment, touching the edges of a space that reflected the same quiet precision she carried into everything else. There were no reminders of the night before scattered across the room, no lingering evidence of significance. Only stillness, the kind that did not need to be earned anymore. She moved through it with ease, barefoot against the cool hardwood, her steps unhurried, her attention already aligned with the day ahead. The city outside had begun its rhythm again, cars threading through intersections, distant, horns blending into a steady undercurrent of movement. It was familiar, predictable, and for the first time in a long time, completely separate from her sense of self. Her phone rested on the kitchen counter, the screen lighting briefly as notifications continued to arrive, headlines, interviews, requests that would once have felt overwhelming. She glanced at it only once, her eyes scanning just enough to register what was there before she turned away. The attention did not pull at her. It followed her, but it did not lead. She poured a cup of coffee, the steam rising in a thin, quiet line, her fingers wrapping around the warmth as she stepped toward the window. The skyline stretched out in front of her, sharp and defined in the early light, each building standing exactly where it was meant to be. There was a time when she would have looked at it and felt small, as if everything out there existed beyond her reach. Now it felt different, not because the city had changed, but because she had. Across town, Daniel stood in front of his own window, though the view no longer carried the same clarity it once had. The glass reflected him back more than it revealed anything beyond. His expression caught somewhere between recognition and quiet recalibration. The suit from the night before hung neatly over a chair, untouched, as if it belonged to a version of him that had already begun to fade. He had slept, but not deeply. The conversation, the silence, the space between what was said and what was not had settled into him in a way that did not allow for easy dismissal. He moved through his apartment slower than usual, each action deliberate, as if he were testing a new rhythm he had not yet learned. The phone buzzed again, a message this time. Another colleague referencing the news, the momentum, the shift in the market that seemed to follow her name. He read it, then set the phone down without responding. For once, he did not feel the need to insert himself into the narrative. Back in her apartment, Emily set her cup down, reaching for a folder that had been left on the counter, its contents already familiar to her before she opened it. Plans, numbers, decisions that extended beyond recognition, beyond headlines, into something that would continue long after the attention shifted elsewhere. She flipped through the pages, her focus steady, her movements efficient, as if the world outside had not just changed the way it spoke about her. Because for her, it had not. This was always the point. Not the acknowledgement. Not the visibility. The work. A call came through, the name displayed briefly before she answered, her tone calm, direct, already engaged. The conversation was concise, purposeful, a continuation of something already in motion. There was no pause to reflect on how far she had come. Only the next step. Daniel picked up his own phone again, his thumb hovering for a moment before opening a blank message. He stared at the empty space, the cursor blinking back at him, waiting. There were words he could write, apologies he could refine, sentences that might ease something that no longer needed easing. He exhaled slowly, then closed the screen without typing a single letter. Not because he did not have anything to say, but because he finally understood that it was no longer his place to say it. He set the phone down, his reflection catching in the dark surface for just a moment before he turned away. The day continued around them both, moving forward with the same quiet certainty that had always existed, indifferent to individual moments, unaffected by personal realizations. But within that movement, something had settled into its final form. She had built a life that did not require validation. He had come to understand a truth that did not offer correction. And between them, without conflict, without noise, without anything left unresolved, the past had finally lost its hold. Not because it had been rewritten, but because it no longer had a place to exist. By midday, the noise had grown louder, but Emily moved through it as if it were filtered, controlled, reduced to only what mattered. The office floor carried a quiet intensity, not rushed, not chaotic, but focused in a way that did not waste movement. Screens displayed shifting data, conversations unfolded in low, precise tones, Decisions were made without hesitation. She walked through it all with the same steady rhythm. Her presence neither announced nor questioned, simply understood. A meeting was already in progress when she stepped inside the conference room, the discussion pausing for only a fraction of a second before continuing, seamlessly adjusting to include her. Numbers were presented, projections outlined, risks acknowledged without exaggeration. She listened more than she spoke, her attention exact, her questions minimal but direct, each one cutting cleanly through the noise to the core of what needed to be decided. There was no need to assert authority. It was already there, embedded in the way the room responded, in the way decisions settled once she spoke. Across the table, a senior partner leaned back slightly, studying her with a level of respect that had replaced the earlier curiosity. "We can move forward with this," he said, his tone firm, but deferential in a way that acknowledged more than just the data. Emily nodded once, closing the folder in front of her. "Then we move forward," she replied, her voice calm, final, leaving no room for hesitation. The meeting ended without ceremony, chairs sliding back, papers gathered, conversations shifting into smaller clusters as people dispersed to execute what had already been decided. She remained seated for a moment longer, her gaze resting briefly on the empty space across the table, as if measuring something that no longer required measurement. Then she stood, collecting only what she needed, leaving the rest behind. Across town, Daniel sat in his office, the familiar surroundings now carrying a different weight. The desk was the same, the view unchanged, the steady flow of emails and calls continuing without interruption. But the way he moved through it had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. He read more carefully, paused longer before responding, listened without preparing his reply in advance. It was not hesitation. It was awareness. A colleague spoke across from him, outlining a proposal with the same confident tone that Daniel himself had once used without question. He nodded, but did not interrupt, did not redirect. When the man finished, Daniel asked a single question, quieter than his usual approach, but more precise. The room adjusted, the conversation deepened, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something different. Not control, not dominance, clarity. The meeting ended, and he remained seated for a moment, his hands resting lightly against the desk, his reflection faintly visible in the dark screen of his laptop. He did not look away. He did not adjust it. He simply observed it, not with judgment, not with defense, but with an acceptance that did not require commentary. Somewhere across the city, Emily stepped into another conversation, another decision, another forward movement that did not pause to acknowledge what had already been accomplished. She had never built toward a single moment. She had built toward continuity, toward something that would not stop simply because it had been seen. Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window, the skyline stretching out in the distance. It looked the same as it always had, but the way he saw it had changed, not because of her success alone, but because of what it revealed about everything he had once believed. He had thought success was something to claim, to define, to hold in a way that made it visible to others. She had shown him something else, that it could exist quietly, built piece by piece, without needing to be announced, and that when it finally was seen, it would not ask for recognition. It would simply stand, undeniable. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounding, and turned back to his work, not to reclaim what he had lost, not to chase what he could not reach, but to move forward with a different understanding of what that even meant. And in that quiet shift, something settled into place. Not dramatic, not visible, but real. The afternoon light shifted slowly across the glass walls of Emily's office, casting long, clean lines that moved almost imperceptibly with time. Inside, everything remained deliberate, controlled, the kind of environment where nothing happened by accident and nothing lingered longer than it needed to. She stood near the center of the room, reviewing a final set of figures on the screen, her reflection faintly layered over the data, as if the two had become inseparable. Numbers, projections, trajectories. Not as milestones, but as continuations. A quiet knock broke the stillness, followed by a brief update from her assistant. Another request, another opportunity, another decision waiting just beyond the door. Emily listened, nodded once, and gave a simple answer. Schedule it. No hesitation. No need to revisit it. The door closed again, returning the room to its steady rhythm. She turned back to the window, her gaze settling on the city below, not searching, not comparing, just observing. There had been a time when every step forward felt like something that needed to be justified, explained, proven. Now it simply existed. The work spoke. The results followed. And she moved on. Across town, Daniel finished another meeting, the room emptying around him as voices faded into the hallway, leaving behind the quiet echo of what had been decided. He remained seated for a moment, his hands resting lightly on the table, the surface cool beneath his fingertips. The conversation had gone well. Productive. Clear. But what stayed with him was not the outcome. It was the way he had approached it. Slower. More deliberate. Without the need to dominate the space or steer it toward a predetermined conclusion. He had listened. And in doing so, he had seen things he would have once overlooked. He stood, gathering his things with a measured calm, his reflection catching briefly in the darkened screen at the front of the room. It was not unfamiliar anymore. Just different. He stepped out into the hallway, the movement of people around him no longer something to control, but something to move within. Back in her office, Emily picked up her phone, scrolling briefly through a series of messages that had accumulated throughout the day. Invitations, requests, recognition framed in different words, different tones, all pointing to the same thing. She read them without reaction, her expression unchanged, her attention already shifting beyond them. She set the phone down, her focus returning to the next file, the next decision, the next forward motion that did not pause for acknowledgement. Because for her, the recognition had never been the destination. It was simply something that arrived along the way. Daniel paused by a window at the end of the hallway, the city stretching out before him in sharp afternoon light. For a moment, he allowed himself to stand still, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness. The same skyline, the same movement, but no longer filtered through the same assumptions. He had spent years believing that understanding came from defining things quickly, confidently, without doubt. Now he saw something else. That clarity sometimes required space. That certainty could exist without being spoken first. That value did not need to be assigned to be real. He exhaled slowly, the breath steady, grounding, and turned away from the window, his steps carrying him forward without the urgency he once relied on. Somewhere above the city, Emily closed her laptop, the soft click marking the end of one sequence and the beginning of another. She did not linger. In the moment, she did not pause to reflect on what had been completed. She simply moved, because the version of her that needed to look back no longer existed, and the version of her that remained had no reason to.